The year was 2000. On the west coast of Africa, in a nation bled white by a decade of the most savage civil war in modern history, a nightmare was unfolding. Sierra Leone had become a synonymous term for the absolute collapse of the human spirit. It was a land of blood diamonds, child soldiers, and the ritualized form of violence that defied any conventional military logic. In the humid, rotting heat of the Freetown Peninsula, the international community was attempting to patch together a fragile peace under the banner of the United Nations. But in the shadows of the mangrove swamps and the dense vertical jungles of the interior, the ghosts of the war were not ready to surrender. On August 25th, a routine patrol of the Royal Irish Regiment, 11 British soldiers and 1 Sierra Leonean Army liaison officer, was driving along a narrow, red dirt track near the Ochra Hills. They were professional soldiers, well armed and moving in Land Rovers. They were part of a British short-term training team, there to rebuild the shattered Sierra Leonean army. To any observer, they were the embodiment of Western military order. But as they rounded a bend near the village of Magbeni, the order of the British Army collided with the chaotic insanity of a militia known as the West Side Boys. The West Side Boys were not a military organization. They were a drugged-out, alcohol-soaked cult of personality led by a self-styled brigadier named Fode Calais. They wore a bizarre mix of stolen military uniforms, women's wigs, and oversized sunglasses. They believed in juju magic and drank palm wine laced with cocaine and gunpowder. They were the residue of a failed state, men and boys who had known nothing but murder and rape since childhood. And in a moment of catastrophic misjudgment, the Royal Irish Patrol was surrounded, disarmed, and dragged into the heart of the Gberi Bana swamp. When the news reached London, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief and cold fury. The British government had spent millions trying to stabilize Sierra Leone. Now, 11 of its sons were being held in a jungle camp by a group of bandits who were demanding the resignation of the Sierra Leonean government and the release of their imprisoned leaders in exchange for the lives of the hostages. It was a hostage crisis that threatened to collapse the entire peace process. But more than that, it was a direct challenge to the authority of the British Crown. In a windowless room in Hereford, a man looked at a satellite image of a cluster of thatched roof huts surrounded by a wall of green. This was the headquarters of the Director of Special Forces. He didn't see a political crisis. He didn't see juju warriors. He saw a tactical problem that required a surgical solution. He saw a mission that the Pentagon would later describe as high risk, low probability. He saw what would become known as Operation Barras. To understand the sheer audacity of what the British were about to attempt, you have to understand the geography of Gberi Bana. The camp was located on the banks of the Rockall Creek, a serpentine waterway choked with silt and crocodiles. On one side of the creek was Magbeni, the militia's logistics base. On the other side was Gberi Bana, where the hostages were being held. The only way in was by water or by air. The jungle was so thick that a soldier could be 3 feet away from a sentry and never see him. The heat was a physical weight, a 100-degree blanket of humidity that rotted skin and jammed weapons. Fode Calais and his West Side Boys were convinced they were untouchable. They had the hostages, they had the terrain, and they had the magic. They spent their days in a haze of drugs, firing their weapons into the air and filming themselves for the international media. They mocked the British negotiators. They threatened to kill the white boys one by one if their demands weren't met. They believed that the British were too soft, too afraid of a scandal to launch a rescue mission in the middle of a swamp. They were looking at the big army version of Britain. They had no idea that the thinking soldier was already in their midst. While the politicians in London were talking about diplomatic solutions,
a 6-man reconnaissance patrol from D Squadron, 22nd SAS, was already moving through the swamp. These men were the long-distance soldiers that Charlie Beckwith had admired. They had been inserted by boat miles away and had spent days crawling through the mangroves, moving at a pace of less than a mile a day. They lived in the mud. They didn't use radios. They didn't light fires. They watched. From their hide sites, only yards away from the militia sentries, the SAS observers mapped every hut, every heavy weapon, and every pattern of movement. They saw Fode Calais' daily routine. They saw where the hostages were being kept, under guard in a small concrete block building. They saw that the militia had several heavy machine guns and at least one ZPU-2 anti-aircraft gun mounted on a truck. They saw the chaos of the drugged-out fighters, but they also saw that when the West Side boys were threatened, they were capable of a feral, desperate violence that would make any rescue mission a bloodbath. The SAS patrol commander transmitted his findings back to Hereford using a compressed burst transmission. His report was cold and clinical. The hostages are alive, but the window is closing. The militia is becoming increasingly unstable. If we don't move soon, they will start the executions. A ground approach is impossible. A water approach is too slow. It has to be vertical, it has to be fast, and it has to be violent. This was the Hereford binary. There was no almost in this situation. If the SAS launched and failed, the hostages would die. The British government might fall, and the reputation of the regiment would be shattered forever.
The odds were so poor that many in the British Ministry of Defence argued against the raid. They called it Operation Suicide. They pointed to the failure of the Americans at Desert One and the Black Hawk Down disaster in Mogadishu. They said that sending helicopters into a jungle clearing against hundreds of armed insurgents was a recipe for a national tragedy. But the director of Special Forces had a counter-argument. He knew that the West Side boys, for all their bravado, relied on a psychology of fear. They believed they were the predators. The moment they realized they were the prey, their juju would evaporate. But to achieve that, the SAS had to deliver a level of shock and awe that the West Side boys couldn't even imagine. They had to strike with such overwhelming speed and firepower that the militia's drugged brains would short-circuit. The plan for Operation Barras was a masterpiece of thinking soldier logic. It wouldn't just be the SAS, it would be a combined force. D Squadron would take Berry Bana and rescue the hostages. A company of the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 1 Para, would assault Magbeni on the opposite bank to suppress the militia's reinforcements and heavy weapons. The Royal Navy would provide the platform. The RAF would provide the Chinooks. It was a joint operation, but unlike the disaster of Eagle Claw, this was not a committee. It was a single, unified command under the SAS. Every man in 1 Para was a veteran of the hills phase. Every pilot had trained to fly at treetop level in total darkness. They were a single species of soldier. In the final hours before the go signal, the SAS operators at their staging base in Freetown were not doing hooah rituals. They were sharpening knives. They were checking the method of entry explosives. They were rehearsing the room clearances over and over until the 17-second standard was met.
They knew that the moment they touched the ground, they would be outnumbered 10-1. They knew that the jungle would be a wall of lead. And they knew that the thinking soldier doesn't rely on luck. He relies on the binary excellence of his training. One operator, a veteran of the Balkans and Northern Ireland, looked at his teammates as they kitted up. They weren't wearing the big army heavy armor. Они выбрали легкость и мобильность. Они были в DPM-камуфляже, с лицами, выкрашенными в зеленый и черный цвета. Они выглядели как часть самого леса. Remember, the operator said, his voice a low rasp. "The West Side boys think they own the night because they're crazy. We own the night because we're better. Don't give them a second to think. If it moves and it's armed, it's dead. 17 seconds, that's all we give them." The helicopters were warming up on the deck of the HMS Sir Percival. The roar of the Chinook engines was a herald of the coming violence. In Gberibana, Fode Calais was likely drinking palm wine, convinced that he had won his game against the British Empire. He didn't hear the wind changing. He didn't see the 6 pairs of eyes watching him from the mud of the mangroves. He didn't know that the machine of Hereford had been dialed to its final setting. The sun was beginning to set over Sierra Leone. The jungle of lost souls was about to become the forge of the legend. Operation Barras was no longer a plan. It was a countdown. And in Hereford, the clock tower was ticking, a silent witness to the fact that when you send the British into a swamp, they don't just survive, they win. The standard was absolute. The mission was go, and the 17th second was approaching. To the outside world, the hostage crisis in Sierra Leone looked like a chaotic, televised standoff between a civilized nation and a drugged-out militia. But inside the Cabinet Office briefing room, COBR, in London, it was a mathematical equation of risk versus survival. Prime Minister Tony Blair's government was facing a nightmare scenario. If they negotiated, they would be seen as weak, signalling to every warlord in Africa that British soldiers were a tradable commodity. If they launched a rescue and it failed, they would face a Black Hawk Down moment that would haunt the British military for a generation. The big army advisors were cautious. They pointed to the maps of the Rockall Creek. The terrain was a tactical trap. Gberibana was surrounded by a mangrove swamp so dense it was essentially a natural fortress. Any ground approach would be heard miles away. Any helicopter approach would be seen for minutes before touchdown. The West Side boys, for all their erratic behavior, were armed with heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. They were high on brown, a lethal mixture of cocaine and gunpowder, which made them immune to pain and completely unpredictable. "You are asking for a miracle," one senior advisor told the director of Special Forces. "You are asking to fly into a kill zone against 300 armed men with 60 operators. The mathematics of the battlefield say you will lose half the force before they even hit the ground." The director of Special Forces didn't look at the mathematics of the battlefield. He looked at the architecture of the inevitable. He knew that while the machine of the big army saw obstacles, the thinking soldier saw patterns. And to find those patterns, he unleashed the most sophisticated intelligence net in the world. While the world's media was focused on the British negotiators drinking tea with Fode Calais, a different kind of conversation was happening in the shadows. MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, had activated its deep assets in Freetown. These were not men in suits. They were ghost assets, individuals who had lived through the Civil War and knew the tribal connections of the West Side boys. They provided the first granular details, the internal power struggles within the militia, the locations of the heavy weapon mounts, and most importantly, the psychological state of the brigadier. But the gold standard of intelligence didn't come from a satellite or an informant. It came from the mud. 6 men from D Squadron, 22nd SAS, had been inserted into the Ochre Hills under the cover of a tropical thunderstorm. They were the Recce, reconnaissance team. In the Hereford world, the Recce team is the brain of the operation. They do not fight, they observe. They moved through the mangrove swamps at a pace that would drive a normal man insane. They didn't walk, they slithered. They moved inches at a time, testing the mud for the sound of a suction pop, clearing every branch to ensure no leaves rustled. They established observation posts, OPs, less than 50 meters from the Gberibana camp. To understand what this required,
You have to understand the physical reality of the Sierra Leonean jungle. The humidity was 100%. The ground was a rotting soup of organic decay, leeches, and stinging ants. The SAS operators lay in scrapes, shallow depressions in the mud, covered in camouflage netting that had been woven with local vegetation. They didn't move for days. They urinated into containers. They ate cold, flavorless paste. They controlled their breathing so that the condensation wouldn't be visible in the humid air. Through their high-powered optics, they mapped the pattern of life. They saw that Fode Calais was a man of ritual. Every morning at 8 o'clock, he would conduct a parade of his drugged-out fighters. Every evening, the drinking and the brown sessions would begin. They identified the concrete building where the Royal Irish soldiers were being held. They saw the faces of the hostages through the windows.
They saw that the British soldiers were being subjected to mock executions,
forced to stand against walls while West Side boys pulled the triggers on empty chambers. The recce team saw the psychological erosion of the hostages. They saw that the Royal Irish soldiers were reaching their breaking point. The thinking soldier in the mud transmitted a single, devastating insight back to Hereford. The militia is no longer playing a game. They are entering a state of ritualized psychosis. The hostages are being prepared for slaughter. Negotiation is a stay of execution, not a solution. This was the intelligence trigger. Back in Freetown, at a secret staging area, the assault force was preparing. This was a hybrid entity that would have made Charlie Beckwith proud. It was composed of D Squadron SAS and a company from one para, the Parachute Regiment. The paras were the muscle of the operation. In the British system, one para is the primary support unit for special forces. They are the elite of the conventional army, men who have survived the P Company selection, which is second only to the SAS in its brutality. But even for the paras, Operation Barras was a departure from everything they knew. They weren't being asked to take a hill or hold a line. They were being asked to conduct a vertical assault into a jungle clearing, suppressed by the fire of their own helicopters, and to hold a position against 10-to-1 odds. The rehearsals were conducted in a secret location that mirrored the geography of Gaberibana. The SAS operators and the paras worked in a reflexive loop. They practiced the helicopter fast rope insertions until they could get 20 men on the ground in less than 15 seconds. They practiced the simultaneous strike, where the SAS would hit Gaberibana to rescue the hostages at the exact same millisecond that the paras hit Magbeni on the opposite bank to destroy the militia's heavy weapons.
The timing was governed by the Hereford standard. There was no room for almost. If the paras were 3 seconds late in suppressing Magbeni, the ZPU-2 anti-aircraft guns would shred the SAS Chinooks as they hovered over Gaberibana. If the SAS were 5 seconds late in the room entry, the West Side boys would have time to pull the triggers on the hostages. The synchronization required a level of institutional muscle memory that only years of joint training could produce. They were no longer two different units. They were a single scalpel. While the soldiers were rehearsing, the political battle in London was reaching its climax. Tony Blair was being told by the Americans that the mission was too risky. The memory of Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu, where an elite American force was trapped in a city and slaughtered, hung over the discussion like a curse. The Pentagon's advisors were blunt. If you lose a Chinook over that swamp, you lose the mission. You will have dozens of dead British soldiers on the evening news, and you will have accomplished nothing. But the SAS had a secret weapon that the Americans didn't account for: the austerity of force. The Americans in Mogadishu had relied on massive convoys and circling helicopters that announced their presence. The British were planning to use the jungle itself. They were going to fly below the canopy,
using the roar of the Chinook engines as a psychological weapon rather than just a transport. The decision came down to a single phone call between the Prime Minister and the Director of Special Forces. "Can you get them out?" Blair asked. The director didn't give a hoo-ah speech. He didn't promise a miracle. He gave the Hereford answer. The recce teams are in place. The pattern of life is mapped. The men have hit the 17-second standard. We have the initiative of the shadows. If we go now, we win.
If we wait, we bury them. Blair gave the order. Operation Barras is a go. The date was set for September 10th, 2000. The time? 6:16. Dawn in the jungle. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on the night of the 9th, the staging base in Freetown became a tomb of silence. The SAS operators were kitting up. They didn't use the heavy, big army helmets. They used lightweight bump helmets or simple boonie hats. They stripped their gear to the absolute minimum: ammunition, grenades, and medical kits. They knew that in the 100-degree heat of the swamp, every extra pound was a second lost. And a second lost was a life gone. They checked their weapons. The C8 carbines with suppressors, the MP5s for the room clearances, the L7A2 general-purpose machine guns, GPMG, for the cordon elements. They checked the method of entry charges, the small, precise explosives that would turn a concrete wall into dust in a fraction of a second. One trooper, a veteran who had been through the long drag 3 times as an instructor, looked at his 4-man team. They were sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the glowing dials of their watches. "The West Side boys think they are warriors because they have guns and drugs," he said quietly. "We are warriors because we have the standard. When those Chinooks touch the air over that camp, the militia's world is going to end. They won't even have time to scream. 17 seconds, lads. From the rope to the room. Don't let the clock beat you." In the mud of the Gaberi Bana swamp, the SAS recce team saw the camp settling into its nightly routine of drug-fueled celebration. Fode Calais was in his hut. The Royal Irish hostages were huddled together in their concrete cell, likely praying for a miracle they didn't believe was coming. The recce team checked their suppressed weapons. They were the initial strike. At 6:16, their job was to neutralize the sentries before the helicopters were even heard. They were the ghosts in the grass. The machine was now in motion. The Chinooks were on the pads, their rotors beginning to turn. The paras were loaded, their faces masked in green paint. The SAS were in the lead aircraft, the thinking soldiers, who were about to prove that 18 months of selection and years of training were worth more than an army of 300. The jungle of lost souls was silent, but the air was heavy with the coming Hereford thunder. The 17th second was no longer a training goal. It was the boundary between life and death for 11 British soldiers. And Charlie Beckwith, wherever his spirit was, would have recognized the smell of the air. It was the smell of quality, preparing to dismantle quantity. At 6:15 on the morning of September 10th, 2000, the jungle of lost souls was a cathedral of humid silence. The Rockall Creek was a mirror of dark water, reflecting the first bruised purples and greys of a West African dawn. In the village of Gaberi Bana, the West Side boys were in a state of chemical collapse. After a night of palm wine and brown, the sentries were sluggish, their weapons leaning against the thatched walls of their huts. They believed they were protected by the swamp, by the hostages, and by the juju of their leader. They didn't know that the air above them was about to be torn apart by the sound of retribution. 3 miles to the west, 2 RAF Chinook HC.2 helicopters were screaming across the treetops at a height of less than 50 feet.
To fly a massive twin-rotor transport helicopter at 90 knots through a vertical jungle in the pre-dawn light is an exercise in mechanical faith. The pilots, drawn from the elite 7th Special Forces flight of the RAF, were using night vision goggles that turned the world into a grainy green blur of branches and shadows.
They were flying nap of the earth, following the contours of the Rockall Creek, their rotors so close to the trees that the downdraft was shredding the leaves into a green blizzard behind them. Inside the lead Chinook, 20 men of D Squadron, 22nd SAS, sat in 2 rows. They were the residue. They didn't talk. They didn't look at each other. They checked their watches, the ticking seconds the only rhythm in a world of vibration and roar. They were the thinking soldiers, who had been trained to function in the vacuum of choice. In less than 60 seconds, they would be exiting a hovering aircraft into a wall of lead. The SAS philosophy of the grueling approach had been replaced by the philosophy of the vertical strike. They knew that the moment the helicopters were heard, the clock for the hostages' lives began to run. They had exactly 17 seconds from the time the ropes hit the ground to the time the first door was breached. At 6:16, the silence of the swamp was obliterated. The 2 Chinooks flared over Gaberi Bana, their massive rotors flattening the grass and blowing the roofs off the huts. At the exact same millisecond, across the creek in Magbeni, 2 other Chinooks carrying the men of 1 para flared over the militia's logistics base. The simultaneous strike had begun. For the West Side boys, the arrival of the Chinooks was not a military event. It was a psychological apocalypse. The drugged-out fighters stumbled out of their huts, blinded by the dust and the sheer physical weight of the noise. They looked up to see the ghosts of Hereford descending from the sky. The SAS operators didn't wait for the helicopters to touch the ground. They fast-roped from 30 feet, sliding down thick nylon lines into the center of the camp. The moment their boots touched the mud, they were in a reflexive loop. They didn't need orders. They didn't need a plan. They were the plan. One 4-man team moved instantly toward the concrete building where the Royal Irish hostages were being held. They were the primary scalpel. As they crossed the 30 meters of open ground, the air around them became a hive of tracers. The West Side boys, despite their shock, began to fire from the windows and doorways. They didn't aim, they sprayed, sending bursts of automatic fire in erratic arcs. In the Hereford world, this is the noise of the amateur. The SAS operators responded with controlled pairs. 2 rounds to the chest, 1 to the head. Silent, precise, and lethal. They moved in a high-velocity file, using the smoke and the dust of the Chinooks as a shroud. At the door of the hostage building, the lead operator, the breacher, placed a frame charge. The detonation was a focused slap of pressure that turned the wooden door into splinters. Before the dust had even settled, the 4-man team flowed into the room. 17 seconds. The Royal Irish soldiers were huddled on the floor, their hands over their heads. They saw the ghosts enter. They saw the suppressed muzzles of the C8 carbines. They heard the thud, thud of the suppressed rounds neutralizing the guards before the militia could even raise their weapons. "British Army, stay down, stay down." It was the first English they had heard in weeks that didn't involve a threat of death. In the corner of the room, one of the West Side boys reached for a grenade. He was shot 3 times by the number 4 man in the stack before his hand even reached the pin. This was the 17-second standard in its purest form, a biological dominance of the battlefield. While the SAS were securing the hostages, the men of 1 para were turning Magbeni into a furnace. The paras were the hammer to the SAS scalpel.
They had landed in the middle of the militia's heavy weapons park, and they were engaging in a brutal, close-quarters firefight against hundreds of fighters.
The paras used linear fire discipline. They established a perimeter and began to systematically dismantle every heavy weapon in the camp. They destroyed the ZPU-2 anti-aircraft guns with LAW rockets. They suppressed the militia's machine gun nests with sustained fire from their own GPMGs. Their job was to ensure that the SAS Chinooks could extract the hostages without being shot out of the sky. The Rokal Creek had become a wall of lead. The crossfire between Beribana and Magbeni was so intense that the water was literally boiling with the impact of thousands of rounds. Back in Beribana, the SAS had secured the 11 Royal Irish soldiers and the Sierra Leonean liaison officer. They were moving them toward the extraction Chinook, which was still hovering, its grey-man pilots holding the massive aircraft steady in a crosswind of bullets. But the jungle of lost souls was not finished with its cruelty. As the SAS team moved across the open ground, a burst of fire came from a hidden bunker near the water's edge. A single round struck Trooper Brad Tinian, a 28-year-old operator from D Squadron. It hit him in the side, bypassing his light armor. He went down in the mud. In the American Big Army system, a casualty in a hot LZ often triggers a paralysis of the mission. The machine stops to process the trauma. But in Hereford, a casualty is a tactical reality that must be managed, not a reason to stop. "Man down! Carry on the mission!" The SAS operators didn't hesitate. They didn't huddle around Tinian. They continued the extraction chain. 2 men grabbed Tinian and dragged him toward the helicopter, while the rest of the team provided a circle of lead that neutralized the bunker. They reached the Chinook. The hostages were pushed into the belly of the aircraft. Tinian was lifted in, his brothers already applying trauma dressings while the aircraft was still under fire. The SAS commander, the thinking soldier at the center of the storm, looked at his watch. The entire operation from the ropes to the ramp had taken less than 20 minutes. The Chinooks lifted, their engines screaming as they clawed for altitude. They flew low over the creek, the paras in Magbeni providing a final, massive suppression wave to protect the exit. As the helicopters cleared the tree line and turned toward Freetown, the silence began to return to the swamp. But it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a broken juju. Fode Calais had been captured. He had been found hiding under a bed in his hut. The brigadier of the West Side Boys reduced to a shivering prisoner in the hands of the ghosts. His militia was in ruins. Over 150 West Side Boys had been killed. Their logistics base was a smoking crater. Their magic had been proven a lie by 60 men who didn't believe in magic, only in the standard. Back at the staging base in Freetown, the hostages were led off the planes. They were gaunt, traumatized, and exhausted. But they were alive. They had been rescued from the heart of a suicide mission because 60 men had decided that almost was not an option. But the atmosphere in the SAS compound was not celebratory. It was somber. Brad Tinian had died of his wounds during the flight. He was the only British fatality of Operation Barras. One operator, his face still covered in the green mud of the Beribana swamp, sat on a crate and cleaned his weapon. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't talk to the Big Army officers, who were already calling the mission a triumph. He looked at the empty seat where Tinian should have been sitting. "He hit the standard," the operator said quietly to no one. "He was on the ropes. He was in the room. He did his bit."
The clock just stopped for him, that's all. This was the price of iron. In the Hereford world, you can do everything right. You can pass selection, you can hit the 17-second standard, you can be the thinking soldier at the peak of your craft.
and you can still be killed by a random piece of lead in a swamp. The SAS didn't promise its men survival. It only promised them the opportunity to be the best in the world before the end came. Operation Barras was a strategic masterstroke. It rescued the hostages, destroyed the militia, and stabilized the nation of Sierra Leone. It proved that the British scalpel was still the sharpest instrument of war in the 21st century. But more than that, it was the final vindication of the austerity of force. The British hadn't used a carrier battle group or a division of infantry. They had used 60 men and a handful of helicopters. They had used the geography of failure as their training ground and the binary excellence as their guide. In the Pentagon, the analysts watched the footage of the raid with a mixture of awe and confusion. How did they do it with so little? They asked. How did they survive a vertical assault into a jungle clearing against 300 men? The answer was the same one Charlie Beckwith had found in 1962. We measured them by our standards. We should have measured them by theirs. The Hereford thunder had passed, but the echoes were still rolling through the jungles of the world. The 17 seconds of Gberi Bana had become a part of the law. And as the SAS operators kitted down and prepared for the next flight, the clock tower in Hereford continued to tick. Selection was over for some, but for the thinking soldier, the next grid reference was already being marked on the map. When the heavy ramps of the Chinook HC-2s slammed shut on the tarmac at Lungi Airport in Freetown, the thunder of Operation Barras did not simply stop, it transformed.
For the 60 men of D Squadron, 22nd SAS, and the company of 1 para, the transition from the absolute high-velocity violence of the Gberi Bana swamp to the sterile, sun-bleached reality of a secure military airfield was a psychological bends. In the space of 20 minutes, they had moved from a world where every heartbeat was a tactical decision into a world where they were expected to stand in line, count their ammunition, and begin the clinical process of decompression. The air in Freetown was thick with the smell of aviation fuel, salt, and the lingering metallic scent of the jungle that clung to their DPM smocks. But the loudest sound was the silence. In the Hereford world, the aftermath of a raid is governed by a protocol as rigid as selection itself. It is called Tactical Questioning and Debriefing, TQD. Before a soldier is allowed to sleep, before he is allowed to eat, and certainly before he is allowed to process the death of a brother like Brad Tinian, he must download his memory. Every round fired, every doorway entered, every heartbeat of the 17-second standard must be accounted for while the neural imprint is still fresh. The SAS operators were led into a series of air-conditioned tents. They sat on plastic crates, their faces still smeared with the green and black cam cream of the jungle. They looked like ghosts returning from the underworld. A debriefing officer, often a senior NCO, who had seen a dozen such downloads, sat across from them with a notebook. "Start from the ropes," the officer would say. "Tell me about the resistance in the first hut. Who did you engage? What was the target discrimination? Did the ZPU-2 fire before or after the flare?" This process is not for the benefit of history. It is a psychological bypass. By forcing the operator to treat the mission as a technical dataset, the regiment helps him externalize the violence.
If the raid is a series of solved problems, then the killing of another human being at 3-meter range is not a moral weight. It is a resolved variable. But as the operators moved through the debrief, the post-mission vacuum began to pull at them. This is the phenomenon where the brain, having operated at 1000% capacity during the strike, suddenly finds itself with nowhere to go. The adrenaline dump is a physical crash that leaves men shivering in 100-degree heat. Their hands, which were steady enough to fire controlled pairs into a target's head seconds earlier, now trembled as they reached for a bottle of water. One operator, A man who had cleared the third hut in Gberibana sat in the silence of the tent and realized he couldn't remember the face of the man he had shot. He remembered the texture of the plasterboard wall. He remembered the smell of the gunpowder. He remembered the exact weight of the trigger pull. Но лицо врага стерлось. Это и есть психология призрака. Состояние, в котором ты становишься инструментом настолько совершенным, что твоя собственная личность временно перестает существовать. While the SAS were downloading their memories, the intelligence machine was focusing on its most valuable prize, Fodé Calais. The brigadier of the West Side Boys was no longer a warlord. Stripped of his women's wigs, his juju charms, and his drugged-out entourage, he was a pathetic, shivering figure in a standard-issue prisoner's jumpsuit. He had been moved to a high-security interrogation room in Freetown, overseen by a combined team of SAS Intelligence Corps and MI6 officers. The interrogation of Fodé Calais was a masterclass in the Hereford approach to human intelligence. There was no torture. There were no bright lights or big army shouting. The SAS knew that for a man like Calais, who ruled through fear and theatricality, the most devastating weapon was indifference. The interrogator sat in the room with him, wearing civilian clothes. They spoke in quiet, professional tones. They showed him satellite photos of his destroyed camp. They showed him the bodies of his generals. They didn't call him brigadier. They didn't even use his name. They treated him like a minor administrative error that was being corrected. "Your magic didn't work, did it?" one officer asked quietly. "The helicopters came through the trees, and your juju didn't stop a single bullet. You told your boys they were gods. Now they are meat in a swamp. Do you want to tell us where the rest of the arms caches are, or should we just go back and finish the job?" This is psychological dominance. By stripping away the mythological vibe that Calais had built around himself, the British were not just extracting information, they were demythologizing the insurgency. Calais broke within hours. He began to talk, not out of fear of pain, but out of a desperate need to be relevant again. He gave up locations, names, and financial backers. He was the residue of a failed dream, a ghost of a man who realized that his suicide mission had been a one-sided slaughter. But the most complex psychological landscape of Operation Barras was not in the interrogation room or the SAS debrief. It was in the minds of the 11 Royal Irish hostages. Survival guilt is a predatory emotion. As the Royal Irish soldiers were moved to a secure facility to begin their own recovery, they were struggling with a profound sense of shame. In the British military culture, being captured is often viewed, rightly or wrongly, as a failure of the standard. They were professional soldiers who had been disarmed by a group of vagrants in wigs.
Major Phil Ashby and his men were suffering from what psychologists call capture trauma. For weeks, they had lived in the shadow of the executioner. They had been subjected to mock executions, starvation, and the constant erratic threats of drugged teenagers. Their internal order had been systematically dismantled. The arrival of the SAS had been a resurrection, but it was a resurrection that came with a price. They were now the rescued. In the hierarchy of the military, they felt like they had lost their status as warriors. "We were waiting for the end," one of the Royal Irish soldiers later recalled, "and then the sky fell in. The SAS didn't just save our lives, they showed us what we were supposed to be, and that was the hardest part. Looking at those men in the mud, seeing how they moved, how they didn't hesitate, it made us realize how far we had fallen." The SAS medical and welfare officers worked with the hostages using a technique called cognitive reframing. They had to convince these men that their survival was not a failure, but a tactical success of endurance. They had to rebuild the thinking soldier within the Royal Irish. Meanwhile, back in Hereford, the regiment was performing its most sacred and silent ritual, the empty chair debrief.
Brad Tinian's death was a void in D Squadron. In a unit that never exceeds 60 operational members per squadron, the loss of one man is a 1.6% reduction in the total global capability of the regiment. But emotionally, it was 100% of a brother. The SAS doesn't have grand, televised funerals for its fallen. They have a private gathering at Stirling Lines. They drink a toast to the missing man. They don't give hoo-ah speeches about sacrifice. They talk about Tinian's performance on the long drag. They talk about his 17-second clearing during a training cycle in Belize. They talk about him as a variable that performed to the standard until the very end. This stoicism is the austerity of Hereford. It is a defense mechanism that allows the regiment to stay functional. If they allowed themselves to mourn like conventional soldiers, they would be paralyzed by the cumulative trauma of 60 years of shadow wars. Instead, they encode the fallen into the law. Brad Tinian became part of the geography of failure that future candidates would study. He became a reason for the next recruit to push harder during selection, to ensure that his standard was worthy of the name on the clock tower. The strategic ripples of Operation Barras were now reaching the highest levels of global military thought. In the Pentagon, the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, was conducting a deep dive analysis of the raid. The Americans were obsessed with the economy of force. They looked at the numbers: 60 SAS, 100 Paras, 4 Chinooks. They compared it to the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu, Black Hawk Down, where 160 US Rangers and Delta operators were trapped and 18 were killed. The British went into a vertical jungle against a larger force, and they extracted everyone with one fatality, an American analyst wrote in a classified memo. They did it because they didn't use overwhelming force. They used cognitive overmatch. They manipulated the enemy's psychology before they even fired a shot. They used the vibe of the SAS as a force multiplier. This was the final verdict on the Hereford philosophy in the year 2000. It proved that in the 21st century, the greatest weapon was not the machine, but the ghost. The ability to appear, strike, and vanish without ever leaving a footprint on the conventional world. Operation Barras had saved the SAS not just from a tactical failure, but from a relevance crisis. It proved that even in an era of satellite-guided bombs and high-tech surveillance, you still needed a man who was willing to crawl through a mangrove swamp for 4 days to find the truth. But as the operators of D Squadron finally boarded the flight back to RAF Brize Norton, their post-mission vacuum was being filled by a new reality. They were no longer the men who had left Hereford 3 weeks earlier. They were the men who had seen the 17th second. They were the species that Charlie Beckwith had dreamed of. One trooper, sitting in the back of the transport plane, looked at his hands. They were finally still. He looked at the map of the Rockall Creek, now folded and tucked into his pocket. He knew that tomorrow he would be back in Hereford. He would be at the bar. He would see Tinian's name being carved into the stone, and then he would go back to the hills. Because the thinking soldier knows that the suicide mission is never over. It is just a preparation for the next long drag. The psychology of the ghost is a cycle of destruction and rebirth. You destroy your ego to survive selection. You destroy your personality to survive the mission, and then you try to find the residue of yourself in the silence that follows. Operation Barras was a triumph of the standard, but as the plane touched down in England, the ghosts knew the truth. The jungle is always waiting. The brown warriors are always out there, and the 17-second clock is always ticking. The architecture of the inevitable was complete, but the standard was already moving to the next grid reference. When the dust finally settled over the Rockall Creek, and the last of the charred huts in Gaberi Bana had collapsed into the mud, the world of special operations found itself staring at a new reality.
Operation Barras was not just a successful hostage rescue, it was a strategic resurrection. In the year 2000, the British military was facing a crisis of identity.
The Cold War was over. Budgets were being slashed, and the big army generals were questioning the relevance of maintaining expensive, elite units that spent more time training in secret than they did on the front lines. There was a growing sentiment in London that the era of the Shadow War was a relic of the past, and that the future belonged to peacekeeping and diplomacy. Operation Barras murdered that sentiment in 17 seconds. The mission proved that in a world of failed states, drugged-out militias, and unpredictable grey space threats, the only thing that could prevent a national catastrophe was a small number of thinking soldiers who operated outside the conventional box. It proved that a division of infantry could occupy a country, but it took 60 men and a binary excellence mindset to save its soul. The tactical ripples of Barras were felt first in the relationship between the SAS and the parachute regiment. For decades, there had been a professional friction between the Tier 1 operators of Hereford and the elite infantry of the paras. The SAS viewed themselves as the scalpel, while they saw the paras as the hammer. But in the smoke of Magbeni, that distinction evaporated. The SAS realized that in the high-intensity urban and jungle environments of the future, the scalpel needed a cordon of iron to protect it. They needed a force that shared their DNA, their training standard, and their violence of action. This realization led directly to the creation of the Special Forces Support Group, SFSG, in 2006. Operation Barras was the unofficial selection for this new concept. The way the men of one para had suppressed 300 insurgents while the SAS cleared the rooms was the blueprint. Today, whenever the SAS or the SBS, Special Boat Service, deploy on a high-value target raid in the Middle East or Africa, the SFSG is there, providing the hammer that was forged in the Sierra Leonean swamp.
The thinking soldier had expanded his team. But what of the enemy? The West Side boys did not just experience a military defeat. They experienced a psychological annihilation. Fode Calais, the man who believed his juju made him a god, spent the rest of his life as a broken number in a prison system. He was handed over to the Special Court for Sierra Leone and eventually sentenced to 50 years for war crimes, including murder, rape, and the enslavement of children. The militia itself simply vanished. Those who weren't killed at Gaberibana or Magbeni threw away their weapons and fled into the deep jungle. Their magic had been proven a lie by 60 men who didn't use charms, only accumulated repetition and controlled pairs. The jungle of lost souls was reclaimed by the people of Sierra Leone, and within months of Operation Barras, the civil war effectively ended. The residue of the conflict had been swept away by the Hereford Thunder. However, the price of iron remained. In Hereford, at the base of the clock tower, the name of Brad Tinian was added to the list of the missing. His death was the only thing that prevented Operation Barras from being a perfect mission. But in the SAS culture, there is no such thing as a perfect mission. There is only the mission you survive and the mission you don't. One former squadron commander, speaking years later about the legacy of Tinian, said, "Brad didn't die because the plan failed. He died because the jungle is honest. You can be the best trained operator in the world. You can hit every grid reference and clear every room. But if a piece of lead has your name on it, the clock stops. We don't mourn the death. We honor the standard." Brad was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was selected to do.
That is the only comfort the regiment offers. This cold clinical stoicism is what Marcus Dunlap and Charlie Beckwith saw as a different species. It is the ability to accept the absolute finality of death as a tactical variable.
It is what allows the SAS to continue operating in the most suicidal environments on Earth, without the emotional friction that slows down conventional armies. The 21st century has only intensified the need for the Barras mindset. In the years following 2000, as the world moved into the global war on terror, the SAS became the primary night hunter of the coalition. In Iraq, under Task Force Black, they executed over 1,000 raids that mirrored the Gaberibana strike. They used the same silent approach, the same 17-second standard, and the same austerity of force. They proved, over and over, that the Pentagon's obsession with platform-centric warfare, more drones, more sensors, more satellites, was only half the story. The other half was always the thinking soldier, the man who could operate when the drone was jammed, the man who could navigate when the GPS was dead, the man who could sense the vibe of a street and know that an ambush was waiting, long before the thermal cameras detected a heat signature. Operation Barras remains the gold standard for this philosophy. It was a mission conducted with minimal equipment, under-resourced by American standards, and launched into a denied area where failure was the only logical outcome. And yet, it succeeded because of the individualist, because of the residue. The American JSOC commanders who studied Barras eventually implemented their own versions of the recce assault hybrid. They realized that overwhelming firepower often created more problems than it solved in a counterinsurgency. They began to value the British scalpel and started to train their own Tier 1 units in the art of the long wait and the austerity of the shadow. But as the machine of special operations becomes increasingly digital, the Hereford Standard faces its greatest challenge. We live in an era of AI-driven targeting, autonomous drones, and zero-risk doctrines. The temptation for governments today is to replace the thinking soldier with a thinking algorithm. They want the results of Operation Barras without the risk of a Brad Tinian. The SAS response to this is a silent, stubborn adherence to the hills. Selection in the Brecon beacons has not changed since 1950. The Bergens are still 60 pounds. The long drag is still 64 kilometers. The weather is still horizontal sleet. The DS are still silent. They know that you cannot automate the soul of an operator. You cannot program the will to endure into a piece of silicon. The quality gap that Charlie Beckwith identified in 1962 is still there, and it can only be bridged by a human being who is willing to be destroyed and rebuilt in the mud of South Wales. As the jungle of lost souls in Sierra Leone grows back over the ruins of Beribana, the lesson of Operation Barras remains as sharp as a Fairbairn Sykes dagger. It tells us that in the final analysis, quantity is a ghost that disappears when the thunder starts. It tells us that 60 men who know exactly what they are doing are more dangerous than 60,000 who are just following a manual. It tells us that the 17th second is the only time that matters. The thinking soldier is still out there. He is in a hide site in a desert you can't find on a map. He is in a civilian car in a city where he shouldn't be. He is sitting in a market, drinking tea, watching the children play, and mapping the architecture of the inevitable. He doesn't have a $40,000 helmet. He doesn't have a direct link to the president. He has a map, a compass, a suppressed carbine, and the standard carved into his mind. He is the residue of 60 years of shadow wars, and in Hereford, the clock tower continues to tick. It ticks for the candidates who are currently shivering on Penny Fan. It ticks for the operators who are currently over the target. And it ticks for the ghosts who never came home from the swamp. The legacy of iron is not a story of the past. It is a warning for the future. It says, don't ignore the warning. Don't bet against the British, and never ever assume that the machine can beat the man. Operation Barras was the moment the suicide mission became the standard. And as long as there are hostages in concrete cells and warlords with juju dreams,
The ghosts of Hereford will be waiting for the go signal. Selection never ends. The 17th second is always now. Who dares wins.